Picture this. You're 17 years old, in Athens, walking through the agora, and an older man approaches your father, not to discuss business, not to arrange a marriage, but to formally propose becoming your mentor, your protector, your patron. And here's the part your textbook somehow forgot to mention. Your father doesn't punch him. Your father considers the proposal. Because in 5th century Athens, this isn't scandal. This is education. This is citizenship. This is, in a very specific sense, how you're supposed to become a man. Now hold that image, because for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 9 civilizations that looked at what we now call queerness and just didn't have a problem with it. Some celebrated it, some institutionalized it, some built temples around it, and then someone came along and burned the evidence. So the real question isn't whether queer people existed in history. The wild part is, we, the people who find this shocking, are the historical anomaly. We're the weird ones. And by the end of this, I think you'll see exactly how that happened. Ancient Greece, where everyone was at least a little bit gay. Let's start with the obvious one. Everyone vaguely knows the Greeks were into it, but most people don't realize how deep it ran. We're talking about an entire society where same-sex desire wasn't a hidden subculture. It was woven into philosophy, into the army, into the gymnasium, into the way poetry was written. Plato's Symposium, around 385 BCE, is literally a dinner party where 7 men take turns making speeches about the nature of love. And most of those speeches are about men loving men, not as a fringe topic, as the default example. Sappho was writing on the island of Lesbos in the 7th century BCE, and yes, that's where the word lesbian comes from, composing some of the most achingly beautiful love poetry ever written, addressed to women. He seems to me equal to gods, that man who sits across from you. That fragment survived 2,600 years because even ancient critics couldn't stop quoting it. Then there's the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military unit of 150 pairs of male lovers, formed around 378 BCE. The theory was simple. A man fights harder when his beloved is watching. They went undefeated for decades. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Philip of Macedon's forces finally annihilated them. And when Philip walked the battlefield afterward and saw the pairs lying together where they'd fallen, he reportedly wept. Now, important honesty check. Greek society had hierarchies. The accepted form was almost always asymmetric, structured around age and social role, and modern scholars rightly find the inclusion of adolescence in these relationships deeply troubling by today's ethics. We name the structure as a matter of historical fact, and we name our modern judgment of it just as clearly. But the broader point holds. Adult same-sex love, female-female love, devoted partnerships, none of that needed to hide. It was simply life. Rome, the empire that couldn't keep it in its toga. Rome inherited a lot from Greece, including the assumption that a man could desire other men without anyone losing sleep over it. What Rome added was scale, paperwork, and emperors who didn't care who knew. The Roman framework was less about gay or straight, and more about active versus passive. Who was doing the desiring, and who was being desired. As long as a freeborn Roman man was on the dominant side of that equation, his choice of partner barely registered as a moral question. Catullus, around 60 BCE, wrote love poems to a young man named Juventius, right alongside his poems about his mistress, Lesbia, and nobody clutched their pearls. But the case study everyone should know is Emperor Hadrian and Antinous. Hadrian was one of Rome's most capable rulers, the man who built the wall across northern Britain. Antinous was a young Greek man from Bithynia, and Hadrian loved him so openly, so completely, that when Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 CE, Hadrian didn't just mourn. He founded a city in his name, Antinopolis. He had him declared a god. He commissioned so many statues of his beloved that today, almost 2,000 years later, Antinous is one of the most depicted faces from the entire ancient world. An emperor, deifying his male lover, and the empire said, yeah, that tracks. There was also Emperor Elagabalus in the 3rd century, who according to ancient sources lived as a woman, married a man named Hierocles, and reportedly offered a fortune to any physician who could perform what we'd now call gender confirmation surgery. The sources are hostile and unreliable. Roman historians loved smearing emperors they hated. But the point is that the concept existed. It had a name. It had a Caesar. Mesopotamia, where the gods themselves were genderqueer. Now we go back further, way further, to Sumer, to Babylon, to the cradle of writing itself. The goddess Inanna, later Ishtar, was the most powerful powerful deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon, the goddess of love, war, and transformation. And one of her sacred powers, recorded on clay tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE, was the ability to turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man. That wasn't a curse in the texts, that was a blessing. Her temples were staffed by a class of priests called the gala, who sang lamentations in a special dialect of Sumerian, normally reserved for women, who often took feminine names, and whom modern scholars increasingly read as a recognized third-gender priesthood. There were also the Asunu and the Kogaru, figures who crossed gender lines as a sacred function. They weren't outcasts, they were ritual specialists. They were, in a literal sense, holy. There's a Babylonian text from around 1700 BCE, the Almanac of Incantations, that includes prayers for the love of a man for a man and the love of a woman for a woman, treated as just two more forms of love alongside everything else. The first civilization to invent writing, and one of the first things it wrote down was, yeah, this is all fine. Sit with that for a second. Because every assumption about same-sex love being a modern Western invention dies right there on a clay tablet 4,000 years ago. Pre-colonial Africa, the histories that nearly didn't survive. Here's where the record gets harder, because colonizers burned a lot of it. But what survives is striking. Among the Azande of what's now South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard documented a long-standing practice into the 20th century in which warriors took younger male partners in formal, family-recognized arrangements that included a dowry and customary obligations. Among the Mosi of Burkina Faso, certain pages of the royal court were known as sorones and were understood to occupy a feminine social role with the king. In ancient Egypt, long before any of this, there's the tomb of Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep, two royal manicurists from around 2400 BCE, depicted nose-to-nose in the embrace traditionally reserved for husband and wife. Egyptologists have debated for decades what that relationship was. Brothers, twins, lovers? The tomb iconography uses every visual cue that Egyptian art normally uses for a married couple, and the simplest reading is the one many scholars now accept: two men, devoted, buried together 2,400 years before Christ. The honest disclaimer here is that Africa is a continent of thousands of cultures, and lumping them together is the colonizers' mistake we shouldn't repeat. But across that vast landscape, the pattern is the same one we keep finding everywhere else. Same-sex love, third-gender roles, gender-crossing ritual, all present, all documented, all denied by the people who showed up later with Bibles and asked everyone to pretend none of it had ever happened. India, the temples that kept the secret in plain sight. Walk up to the temples at Khajuraho, built between 950 and 1050 CE, and look closely at the carvings. Among the thousands of figures on those walls, you'll find men with men, women with women, every configuration the human body allows, sculpted in stone by master artisans who clearly didn't think they were doing anything blasphemous, because they weren't. The Kama Sutra, compiled by Vatsyayana around the 3rd century CE, devotes an entire chapter to what it calls the Tritiya Prakriti, the third nature, describing people of varied genders and same-sex desires as a normal category of human experience. Not a vice, not a sin, a nature. Hindu mythology is full of gods who swap genders. Vishnu becomes Mohini, the enchantress. Shiva merges with Parvati to form Ardhanarishvara, the half-male, half-female deity worshipped to this day. The hijra communities, recognized for at least 2,000 years as a distinct third gender on the Indian subcontinent, trace their origins partly to those mythologies and to royal courts where they served as advisors, guardians, performers. Then the Mughals arrive, and you get a court culture saturated with Persian poetry, where the beloved is grammatically and emotionally ambiguous, where Emperor Babur, in his own memoir, the Baburnama, written in the early 1500s, openly describes his infatuation with a boy named Baburi in the bazaar of Andijan, with the same tender confusion any teenager has ever felt. An emperor, writing it down, for posterity. Then 1861 happens. The British arrive, drag in Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, copy-pasted from Victorian morality, and criminalize carnal intercourse against the order of nature. That law stayed on India's books until 2018. The temples were still standing the whole time. The two-spirit traditions of Indigenous North America. Before 1492, the continent, now called North America, was home to hundreds of distinct nations, and in a striking number of them, anthropologists have documented well over 100, there were people who lived outside the male-female binary, who held specific spiritual and social roles, and who were not just tolerated, but often considered gifted. The modern umbrella term is two-spirit, adopted in 1990 at an indigenous gathering in Winnipeg, and it's meant to honor that this was never one identity. It was 100 different identities in 100 different languages. Among the Diné, or Navajo, the nádleehi held a sacred place in ceremony. Among the Lakota, the winkte were known to bless children with names that brought good fortune. The Zuni had the lhamana, and one of them, wakashū, was sent by their nation as a cultural ambassador to Washington in 1886, where they spent 6 months in the capital, meeting President Grover Cleveland, and most of Washington society had no idea they were meeting someone their own culture would have refused to categorize. Wakashū was just wakashū. When the missionaries in the boarding schools arrived, this was one of the first things they targeted. Children were beaten for the languages that contained these concepts. Ceremonies were outlawed. Two-spirit elders went into hiding for generations, and the violence of that erasure is the reason most Americans alive today have no idea that the land they live on was, for thousands of years, home to gender systems more sophisticated than the one currently being argued about on the news. Edo Japan, the floating world of wakashū. In Tokugawa-era Japan, roughly 1603 to 1868, there was a recognized category of person called the wakashū, young men in a specific stage of life with a specific hairstyle, a specific way of dressing, a specific aesthetic. And in the cultural imagination of the time, the wakashū were considered objects of beauty for both women and older men. We're now talking about adolescence and the social dynamics around them, which means we proceed carefully and we name the obvious. By modern standards, the inclusion of adolescence in such a category is ethically unacceptable, and we judge it that way. As a matter of historical record, though, what's notable is the framework, a society that openly mapped desire onto 3 categories rather than 2, that produced an entire literary genre called nanshoku, male love, celebrated in the woodblock prints of artists like Suzuki Harunobu in the 18th century, and that did so without religious panic. The samurai class had its own tradition of male bonds, sometimes formalized through written oaths that ran parallel to and sometimes overlapped with their marriages. Then comes the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Japan opens to the west, looks around at Victorian Britain, decides it wants to be taken seriously by the imperial powers, and within a generation, an entire vocabulary for non-heterosexual life gets dismissed as embarrassing and shoved into the closet. Not because the culture changed its mind, because it caught a look at itself through a foreign mirror. Polynesia, where the third gender walked into the sea. Across the Polynesian world, Hawaii, Tahiti, Samoa, Tonga, there are traditions of a recognized third gender that predate European contact. In Hawaii, they're māhū. In Samoa, fa'afafine. In Tonga, whakaleiti. In Tahiti, also māhū. Each tradition is its own thing, rooted in its own language, its own genealogies, its own role in the community. The first European explorers documented them with the bewilderment of men whose categories had just shattered. Captain Cook's crew in the 1770s wrote about Tahitian māhū performing women's tasks, dressing in women's ways, partnered with men, fully integrated into family life. The crew thought it was a curiosity. The Tahitians thought the British were the curiosity. Then come the missionaries. London Missionary Society in Tahiti by 1797, Calvinists in Hawaii by 1820, and they get to work. They ban traditional dance because it's lascivious. They ban the language in some places. They ban the recognition of the third gender. Within 2 generations, what had been an ordinary part of village life becomes something whispered about, hidden, criminalized. And here's the kicker. The māhū and whāawhawhine traditions survived anyway. They're still here. You can meet them today. You can talk to elders who remember their grandmothers explaining the role like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, because to their grandmothers it was. The Great Erasure, and who profited from the silence. So now, zoom out. Greece, Rome, Sumer, Egypt, the Azande, the Mughal court, Khajuraho, Edo, the Lakota, the māhū. 9 windows into one enormous, embarrassing fact. The historical default position of human civilizations, when you actually look, is not the rigid binary that we grew up being told was eternal. The rigid binary is the new thing. It's the recent thing. It's the imported thing. So what happened? Well, it's not a mystery. It's a paper trail. Starting in the 4th century CE with the Christianization of the Roman Empire, you get Theodosius issuing edicts. You get pagan temples shuttered. By the medieval period in Europe, ecclesiastical law starts treating same-sex acts as heresy, and heresy gets you killed. Then the colonial period puts it on a global conveyor belt. The Spanish in the Americas execute indigenous people for it on sight in the 1500s. We have the chronicles written by the conquistadors themselves, who were apparently proud of this. The British Empire exports its anti-sodomy laws to every territory it touches. India, 1861. Much of Africa shortly after, the Caribbean, parts of Southeast Asia. Those laws are still in force in dozens of countries today, generations after the British themselves repealed them at home. And while that's happening at the level of law, at the level of history writing, something quieter is going on. Sappho's poems get burned, mostly, by Christian authorities. Antinous gets quietly demoted in textbooks to Hadrian's favorite. Niankhkhnum and Khnumhotep get reclassified as brothers. The hijra get medicalized. The two-spirit get pathologized. Centuries of ordinary human variety get scrubbed, re-narrated, or simply not mentioned. And then, having done all that, the resulting culture turns around and says, this is how it's always been. So when someone tells you queerness is modern or Western or a phase the culture is going through, they have history exactly backward. What's modern is the panic. What's modern is the silence. The diversity is the ancient part. The erasure is the new arrival. And the only reason we have to keep proving it is because the erasure was extraordinarily, deliberately, thoroughly good at its job. If this rewired anything in how you think about history, hit follow. The archive has a lot more like it. And tell me down in the comments, which of these civilizations surprised you the most?